Good afternoon, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to our March 18th session of class. If we're disconnected for more than 10 minutes or so and we can't get back together, please check your Canvas site a little bit later for information regarding this session. Okay, at this time, please type present for your attendance in chat. If you did not sign in with your full name, be sure to include it in the message. Okay, everybody seems to be doing that okay. All right. So what we've been doing so far, I want to cover what we addressed during our last session. We started the chapter on learning. We briefly reviewed how we learn, looking at classical and operant conditioning and previewing cognitive learning as well. We introduced the idea of associative learning. And associative learning, we looked at classical conditioning, which is two stimuli being associated, and also operant conditioning with a behavior and a consequence for that behavior becoming associated. So let's look a little bit more details now at both of these. With classical conditioning, we looked at the concept of neutral stimulus, a stimulus that does not bring about a response in a particular organism. An unconditioned stimulus, which does bring about some sort of response, a natural response called an unconditioned response, and then the conditioned stimulus, and then the conditioned response. Now, we talked about the process of how classical conditioning works. We have this neutral stimulus that does not bring about a response. Then we pair it together with an unconditioned stimulus, which brings about the unconditioned response. Now, after we've paired those two together for a time, the neutral stimulus takes on characteristics of the conditioned stimulus. What I mean by that is that if you pair the NS and CS, the NS and the US together enough, when you present the CS, the conditioned stimulus, it can bring about a response in the organism similar to or exactly like the response we saw earlier. So it becomes the conditioned response. Now, the concept of acquisition is when we pair the neutral stimulus, like a bell, with food for a dog, together. That's going to be the acquisition. As many times we do that, the stronger that bond between the NS and US becomes. And ultimately, when you present that NS, and then it certainly brings about a response in the organism, that NS has transformed itself into a conditioned stimulus. Now, once we have conditioned that stimulus to bring about a response, we can then extinguish that particular bond or that behavior. All we have to do in this case is just keep presenting the conditioned stimulus again and again and again without reintroducing the unconditioned stimulus, the food. After a while, that bond between the CS and that response becomes weaker and weaker. And after a while, you present the CS and nothing happens. It's no longer a conditioned stimulus. We have extinguished that particular conditioning. Now, if we wait for a while after we've extinguished that conditioning and then reintroduce the conditioned stimulus again, and then that organism responds, that's conditioned response. It has recovered, and we refer to that as spontaneous recovery. We also reviewed the terms of generalization and discrimination as well. Then we went into operant conditioning. And operant conditioning is about, again, a behavior and a consequence become associated. This was all based on Thorndike's law of effect, where we have a behavior, if it leads to favorable outcomes, then it's more likely to see that behavior in the future. If it leads to unfavorable, we're less likely to see it in the future. We also introduced the term of positive and negative. Positive really means present, and negative to take away. We also talked about reinforcement and shaping. Reinforcement is anytime a behavior is done and we do some sort of consequence that leads to that behavior being more likely to be produced in the future, that's reinforcement. And shaping is basically just saying that we were trying to shape someone's behavior by reinforcing successive approximations that get closer and closer to that desired behavior. Primary and secondary reinforcers were also discussed. A primary reinforcer is a reinforcer that is naturally rewarding and reinforcing to the organism, like food, for example. Secondary reinforcers, things that we have to learn, that we become conditioned to, like money. Money has no real value. The only value that money has is sort of indirect in that it allows us to get primary reinforcers. And then we talked about continuous versus delayed reinforcers. The key idea about that was this. With continuous reinforcers, As soon as the reinforcer stops, you notice it, okay? And usually when that happens, you stop the behavior that was being reinforced. But with delayed reinforcers, we're not quite sure. With delayed or intermittent reinforcers, we don't know when the reinforcer truly stops, okay? And that led us to schedules of reinforcement where we left off during the last class. So we'll pick it up there. So this is learning part 2. And we start off by looking at reinforcement schedules. One of the last slides that we looked at, and I want to revisit that now, is the different schedules of partial and intermittent reinforcement. Basically, what it comes down to, we may schedule our reinforcements based on an interval of time that has gone by. For example, a fixed interval schedule, which means, for example, we get paid once a week. Or a variable interval schedule, which is happening at an unpredictably often. For example, let's see, a variable interval schedule would be you're patted on the back occasionally by a supervisor. That can be seen as sort of like a reinforcer. Then we have a plan of reinforcement that may be based on a ratio of rewards per number of instances of the desired behavior. For example, we could have fixed ratio schedule, paid for every 10 units of work you complete. So you're working on assignment where you have to produce certain amount of some sort of product and then you get paid. Or it could be a variable ratio schedule. After an unpredictable number of behaviors, for example, unpredictably getting a good job comment about some unit of work you completed by your supervisor. So those are some of the examples about these partial or intermittent reinforcement schedules. Now, I'm going to go through these rather quickly, and you can look over them. If you have any questions, you can contact me to see if you want some clarification on them. But here are some examples. Rat gets food every third time it presses a lever. That would be a fixed ratio schedule based on the amount of instances that they press the lever, and we have a fixed number there, and it's going to be the third time. Getting paid weekly no matter how much work is done. That would be a fixed interval schedule. Getting paid for every 10 boxes you make. Fixed ratio based on a fixed number of instances of doing something, 10 boxes. Fixed ratio. Number 4, hitting a jackpot sometimes on the slot machine. Sometimes variable. You have to do something, you pull in the slot machine lever, variable ratio. Winning sometimes on the lottery, you play once a day. If you play once a day, then it's a ratio. The percentage of behaviors being rewarded and the interval, percentage of days rewarded, are the same. So both answers are going to be correct here. Variable interval and variable ratio. Checking your cell phone all day, sometimes getting a text, variable interval. Buying 8 pizzas, get the next one free, fixed ratio. Fundraiser averages 1 donation for every 8 houses visited, variable ratio. Kid has a tantrum, parents sometimes give in, variable ratio. And number 10, repeatedly checking mail until paycheck arrives, fixed interval. So the notion here is that we have a variety of ways in which we can look at how intermittent schedules of reinforcement can be done. And they all have a slightly different effect on the organism whose behavior is being adjusted here or reinforced. Look at this graph. So here we have a fixed interval leads to slow, unsustained responding. So if I'm only paid for my Saturday work, I'm not going to work as hard on the other days. So what you see here is that it's rather slack, but then the closer it gets to payday, which these hash marks here represent, that's when you get your reinforcement. That's when you do the most work. So like a scallop, okay? So that's what we see with fixed interval. Then we have variable interval. We have a slow, consistent responding here. If I never know which day my lucky lottery number will pay off, I better play it every day. Very steady, very consistent. And you can see here the hash marks or the reinforcement places, they vary. And that's one of the reasons why the behavior is somewhat steady, slow and consistent. You never know when you're going to win. Now let's look at fixed ratio. A fixed ratio has a high rate of responding. Buy 2 drinks, get 1 free. I'll buy a lot of them. So you can see, you know what you're going to get. If it's reinforcing to you, you'll buy it very consistently, a high rate of responding. Then we have variable ratio. This is one of the most powerful ones. High, consistent responding, even if reinforcement stops. This particular schedule of reinforcement, this variable ratio schedule, is resistant to extinction. All right. If the slot machine sometimes pays, I'll pull the lever as many times as possible because it may pay next time. So here we see you get a reward, and then a long time seemingly sort of passes of responding and nothing happens until he goes here. But the responding still happens. Okay, it's a very powerful schedule. So let's look real quickly here at all of these sort of looked at together. So we have the ratio, interval, fixed, and variable. So with a variable interval schedule, we see steady responding. Okay, but with the fixed interval schedule, we see rapid responding near the time of the reinforcement. In this instance, when you're getting paid on Saturday. Here we see a very steep, steady response rate for the variable ratio, and very similar to the fixed ratio. The key difference here with fixed ratio, it's fixed, and so you can figure out what it is. But with variable ratio, it's always going to be somewhat of a mystery as to when it's going to occur. One of the ways you can think of it is this. With a fixed ratio, it's every 10 times you get something free. You know it every 10 times. But with a variable ratio, let's say on average, every 10 times you get something free or you get some sort of reward. You can't really calculate that in your head because it's going to be very variable, unpredictable, and that makes us respond very strongly and consistently and makes it very resistant to extinction. The idea is that the slot machine could be broken and you would never really know it, okay? Because you know that you can go through some spans of time without getting reinforced. I'm going to pause there real quickly to see if there are any questions or clarifications so far. Everyone okay? All right. So we've talked now about reinforcement, which is increasing the likelihood of a behavior based on some sort of consequence. So the consequence increases the likelihood of that behavior occurring. That's reinforcement. This next one, though, this next topic is going to be like the opposite of that. We're talking about punishment. So let's look at what punishment actually is. Punishments have the opposite effects of reinforcement. These consequences make the target behavior less likely to occur in the future, less likely to occur. That should be one thing that you should remember. When we talk about reinforcement, we're talking about increasing a target behavior. When we're talking about punishment, we're talking about decreasing the likelihood of a target behavior occurring in the future. So let's look at positive punishment. Again, remember what we talked about when it comes to positive last time. Positive is introducing something, adding something. And positive punishment, you add something, usually going to be something unpleasant or aversive. And then negative punishment, you usually take away something normally pleasant or desired. You take away TV time, you take away attention, you take away. So in these instances, positive does not mean good or desirable, and negative does not mean bad or undesirable. Positive just means you're introducing something, adding something, and negative means you're taking something away. All right, remember that. All right, so when we talk about punishment, when is punishment effective? Now, punishment is something most people don't really want to think about that much. When people get punished, it's usually it sort of feels like a negative connotation to it. Punishment works best in natural settings when we encounter punishing consequences from actions such as reaching into a fire. If we reach into a fire, we get burned, something that is very, very aversive to the organism, and it teaches us not to reach into a fire. We're less likely to do that into the future. So that's when punishment is really, really effective, when it naturally occurs. No one has to intervene or do anything. It just naturally occurs, so the natural environment sort of punishes your behavior. In that case, opera conditioning helps us to avoid dangers. That's what punishment does. It helps us to avoid dangers in this particular instance. Now, punishment is less effective when we try to artificially create punishing consequences for others' choices. Okay? Severity of punishments is not as helpful as making the punishments immediate and certain. So what this is suggesting here is that a very, very severe punisher is not necessarily as good as making sure that the punisher is something that is immediate and certain. So as soon as someone does something that requires punishment, they get it immediately. There's no delay. It's going to be certain. They can't avoid it, as opposed to making it very, very harsh. Now, obviously, we all know and aware that there are problems with punishing, and here are some of the punishing problems that are associated with it, particularly when it comes to physical punishment. So applying opera conditioning to parenting and the problems with physical punishment. This is corporal punishment, where someone gets spanked, for example. Punished behaviors may simply be suppressed and restart when the punishment is over. So of course, when you're getting punished, you're not going to be doing the problematic behavior at the time, but as soon as the punishment is over, whatever punishment it is, you start back doing it again. So it's just only a temporary relief. Instead of learning behaviors, the child may learn to discriminate among situations. For example, they may avoid those in which punishment might occur. They may behave a certain way around their mother because they know they can get away with it, but not around their father because they won't get away with it. So they just learn when to do those behaviors, which are problematic behaviors. Instead of behaviors, the child might learn an attitude of fear or hatred. So again, depending on how the punishment is delivered and what type of punishment it is, they may become fearful or start to generate some hate, which can interfere with learning. And this can generalize fear or hatred for all adults or many different settings. And of course, physical punishment models aggression and control as a method of dealing with problems. So as you punish, you are also teaching punishment to the person or individual that's getting punished. Now, one other key aspect about this that comes up, if I tell you don't think about the beach, guess what you're going to be thinking about? The beach. Don't think about the waves, the sand, the towels, all this type of stuff. All right, now the question is, if you are told not to do something, are you obeying the instruction? Would you obey the instruction more if you were punished for thinking about the beach? Not really. So what it comes down to is the problems that some people see with punishment is that punishing focuses on what not to do. All the focus is going to be on the thing you're not supposed to do, which does not guide people toward a desired behavior. So one issue that people tend to have with punishing is that punishing is all about the thing that you don't want, as opposed to the thing that you want, the behavior that you want to see. So even if undesirable behaviors do stop, another problem behavior may emerge that serves the same purpose, especially if no replacement behaviors are taught and reinforced. So what it comes down to is that punishment doesn't really get us any closer to the individual or the organism doing whatever the punisher wants them to be doing, whatever that desired behavior is. So in order to teach desired behavior, reinforce what's right more often than punishing what's wrong. So that's the key lesson they're trying to communicate here, is that punishing only is part of the mission, but it's really not the true mission. The true mission is for them to do certain types of behaviors. And so we want to reinforce the good behaviors so we don't have to have punishing the bad behaviors so often. Okay? So one of the things that they suggest is sort of like a following process here. More effective forms of operant conditioning, the power of rephrasing things. Positive punishment. You're playing video games instead of practicing the piano, so I'm justified in yelling at you. So positive punishment, you're introducing something undesirable to the organism or the kid in this instance, but you're explaining to them why. Negative punishment, you're avoiding practicing, so I'm turning off your video game. Taking away something that they find pleasant, okay? Negative, taken away. Negative reinforcement, I'll stop staring at you and bugging you as soon as I see that you are practicing. So the idea here, you're wanting to get a behavior to increase, and negative, you take away the bugging and staring at them, okay, or nagging them. So that behavior, when that behavior increases, so that's negative reinforcement. And positive reinforcement, after you practice, we'll play a game. So they do a behavior, they get a desirable consequence for that behavior. So what it comes down to, in really a very significant way, when we're talking about the types of consequences for operant conditioning when it comes to a variety of types of reinforcement and punishers, this is the table that really sort of describes what goes on. So we have at the tops of each of these columns, adding stimuli or subtracting stimuli and the outcome. So in positive reinforcement, you're adding, you get candy. And positive punishment, you get spanked. All right. Now you can see there's slightly different shadings in these adding and subtracting. The key thing is that you're using desirable stimuli for positive reinforcement, okay, and you're removing desirable stimuli and negative punishment. So your cell phone gets taken away. When it comes to adding unpleasant stimuli and positive punishment, you get spanked, and that you're adding the unpleasant stimulus. And then, and subtracting the stimuli, you have negative reinforcement. You'll stop yelling. Okay, so basically, you take away the yelling, the unpleasant stimuli. So basically, what it comes down to when it comes to positive and negative reinforcement and punishment, it's all about what you're adding and what you're taking away, and whether or not it's something that is a desirable stimuli or an unpleasant stimuli. Okay? All right, I'm going to pause again and see if there are any questions or comments so far. Has anybody ever knowingly used some of these techniques before with their children or with someone that they have responsibility for, or it's been used on you? You guys are perfect children, perfect. So you heard of some of these. Okay, one of the things too is one of the comments that were made earlier is that you need to be able to make sure the punishment is immediate and you can't escape it. And obviously, what happens is sometimes with some kids, for example, or some adults as well, the punishment is not really seen as much of a punishment. It's not seen as unpleasant enough, if that makes any sense. And sometimes we have individuals who are very difficult, lack of better terminology, very difficult. The punishment is not really seen as that bad. It just reminds me of the old cop movies and TV shows from years ago when the cops would come in, rush in, and catch someone doing something wrong, and they would arrest them. And they say, you're going to do 5 to 10 for this, Johnny. And Johnny will say something like, oh, I can do 5 to 10 standing on my head. So if they are responding to it that way, then the punishment really is not seen as really much of a deterrent at all. And therefore, it doesn't really work. And that's one of the issues that we see with some of the punishments is that they don't work. And usually what people do in response to the punishment not work, they just ratchet up the punisher. They just make it more aversive. And then again, it doesn't work. And again, in this day and age, unlike when I was growing up, corporal punishment, when people would be spanking people all over the place, I would be misbehaving in my neighborhood. My parents are nowhere around right now. They're at work or something, and I'm just going crazy. A neighbor that I would barely know would snatch me up and start spanking me. Okay, this day and age, that could never happen. But obviously, it was something that decades ago, when I was a kid, it'd be something that would be more common. So again, we see these things here, and probably many people probably have gone through elementary school and high school and junior high school, and not having had a teacher spank them or paddle them. But when I was in school, it was a common thing. Second grade teacher, fifth grade teacher, they take the ruler out and they do their little paddling thing. So the whole idea is that the world has changed drastically because of that. Do you think, this is a question to you guys, do you think it's better not to have corporal punishment in school where teachers can spank these pupils, or it's a good thing that it's gone? I'm going to wait real quickly here to see if someone responds to that, either verbally or through chat. So one of you think that it's good that it's gone. All right, so no corporal punishment. Well, I guess the question is, has the behavior of children gotten better or worse over the last few decades? That's the question. And I don't think there's a particular correct answer to it, but what do you think? Are things better off now that it's gone, or worse off? All right, so at least one of you think that it's probably gotten a little bit worse. One of the things that we can say is that the environment in which we see children growing up these days is a little bit more access to information, a little bit more craziness that seems to be going around. And that's craziness with quotes here, not really saying crazy. But the idea is that the world is always sort of like in flux, a lot more access to things. And kids do tend to these days grow up a lot faster than we have seen in previous generations. I mean, an elementary school kid today probably knows more than a high school kid in the 1950s when they were in high school. So we do see that these things do sort of go back and forth, but it's a question that many of you will have to deal with as you start your families, or your families get older, deal with new issues out there. I mean, today we have the internet and all that type of stuff, but who knows what will be available in the future. So just wanted to spend some time talking about that real quickly. Now, the other thing I want to cover as we move on here is B.F. Skinner was one of the key individuals that really focused on this operant conditioning based on Thorndike's law of effect. B.F. Skinner's views, looking at his legacy, let's see how it sort of fares based on what we know today. So the way to modify behavior is through consequences. That's what B.F. Skinner basically his main communication was. This leaves out the value of instruction and modeling. So basically, modifying behavior through consequences is one thing, but we need to try to instruct, to tell people what the right things are to do, as well as to model the proper behaviors. The next one, behavior is influenced only by external feedback, not by thoughts and feelings. Remember, B.F. Skinner was a behaviorist, which basically he wanted to see only objective things. And adult humans have the ability to use thinking to make choices in plans. And so his approach does ignore all of those types of things. Okay, the ability to think and to make choices and plans, because he was more of a hardcore behaviorist. So he does not really take the full scope of things when we're talking about people being raised, for example, in children. We should intentionally create consequences to shape the behaviors of others. Natural consequences are more justifiable than the manipulation of others. Even though we'll see this in a future chapter, But behavior modification, you've heard of the term before, I'm sure. Behavior modification is modifying someone's behavior. And it can be seen almost as if you are trying to control people and through some sort of manipulation. But in some degree, that is what is sort of being asked of therapists, for example, who have patients or clients. If they have some sort of behavior that they're doing that's causing some sort of psychological distress for them, they go to seek mental support from a mental health care professional to help them control certain behaviors that they're doing. And to a degree, it is asking to have their behavior modified. It's just going to be to the extent. And then humanity improves through conscious reinforcement of positive behavior and the punishment of bad behavior. But humanity improves through free choice, guided by wisdom, conscience, and responsibility. Just to go back to something we talked about at the very beginning of this course in chapter 1, when we talked about the major movements and waves in psychology, we talked about the Freudian movement and we talked about the behaviorist movement. Recall that the humanist movement that came up as a reaction to the behaviorists and the Freudians, they came up as a reaction to those two because they thought a lot of the control was being taken away from humans and free choice and all this type of stuff. And so humanity, humanist movement wanted to bring that back. And this is what this bullet really talks about here. Humanity improves through free choice, guided by wisdom, conscience, and responsibility, which B.F. Skinner and the Freudians really did not focus on during the height of their particular movements. All right. So let's look at some of the applications of operant conditioning. We see a lot of it in school. Long before the tablet computers, B.F. Skinner proposed machines that would reinforce students for correct responses, allowing students to improve at different rates and work on different learning goals. We see this today where you have individual learning plans for students where they sit down at a computer or using their iPad devices, where it takes one student one way and takes another student a different route altogether to optimize their individual learning. We see operant conditioning in sports. Athletes improve most in the shaping approach in which they are reinforced for performance that comes closer and closer to the target scale, hitting pitches that are progressively faster. So we see people who are in sports psychology use this quite a bit, who are helping professional athletes and professional teams to get the most out of their performances, either if it's an individual tennis player or team sport. So we see this is something that is a very powerful application that has been employed in that particular arena. And then we see it in work. Some companies make pay a function of performance or company profit rather than seniority. They target more specific behaviors to reinforce. For example, oftentimes if you do good work and you are recognized for your good work, you may get a larger bonus at the end of the year. That's something that's going to be reinforcing. Okay, you can share in the profit of the organization. Again, very reinforcing. So we do see that the work of B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning have found homes for themselves in the area of schools, sports, and athletics, as well as work environment. Now, more operant conditioning applications real quickly here. Most oftentimes when people think of operant conditioning, they can relate to it more often when they look at the parenting scenario. They see that operant conditioning is all over it. So rewarding small improvements toward desired behaviors, that's shaping, works better than expecting complete success, and also works better than punishing problem behavior. So again, a couple of things that we've already addressed to a degree. We want to reinforce proper behaviors so we can avoid punishing improper behaviors. We want to give some sort of reinforcers for behaviors that get closer and closer to what you want. For example, you reward a student who's been having some difficulty. You could do this if they were doing D-level work and they get C-level work, even though you want them to get A-level work, you can reward them in some fashion or form for some improvement in their behavior or their performance. You may have noticed this as well. Giving in to temper tantrums stop them in the short run, but increases them in the long run. Once you give in to a tantrum, you have started something that can be very problematic long run. We talked about the variable schedule, okay? And a variable schedule is a very powerful schedule. It makes something more, especially a variable ratio one, which is what we're talking about here. It makes the behavior that's been supported by a variable ratio schedule very, very, very difficult to extinguish. So basically, when you give in to the tantrum, you put yourself, that kid, into a variable ratio schedule, and so they're more likely to do the tantrum again, and ultimately you may be more likely to give in again. So self-improvement, reward yourself for steps you take toward your goals. As you establish good habits, then make your rewards more infrequent and intermittent. One of the reasons we want to do that is because if you reward, externally reward behavior that should be something very intrinsic to you, you could sort of zap your intrinsic motivation for doing certain things. And I think we'll talk about that in a few slides here. But the notion is these are very powerful things that we can do to apply operant conditioning to our life through parenting as well as through self-improvement. All right, so review and compare forms of conditioning before we move on to the next topic. Let's look at what we're talking about here. So we've talked about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. The basic idea of classical conditioning, again, is associating events or stimuli with each other. For operant conditioning, it's going to be the behavior with the consequence for that behavior. For classical conditioning, it's involuntary and automatic reactions such as salivating. We don't have control over that. Make note of that. We don't have control over those involuntary automatic reactions. However, in operant conditioning, we're talking about voluntary actions. We are operating on the environment. We did a behavior because we chose to. Acquisition. An acquisition for classical conditioning, the neutral stimulus is going to be linked to that unconditioned stimulus repeatedly. In operant conditioning, the behavior is associated with punishment or reinforcement in the various ways that we've been talking about. Extinction. In classical conditioning, the conditioned response decreases when the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented alone. In operant conditioning, the target behavior decreases when reinforcement stops. That's extinction. Spontaneous recovery in classical conditioning, the extinguished conditioned response starts again after a rest period. And here, extinguished response for operant conditioning, extinguished response starts again after a rest, no reward. Generalization in classical conditioning, when the CR is triggered by stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. And generalization in operant conditioning, response behavior similar to the reinforced behavior. And discrimination in classical conditioning, the distinguish between the CS and the AS and the NS is not linked to the unconditioned stimulus, and distinguish what will get reinforced and what will not in operant conditioning. So again, we can look at how these two major forms of associative learning really does play out, looking at all these phenomena and aspects and components of them. Basic idea, response, extinction, acquisition, spontaneous recovery, generalization, as well as discrimination. So that sets the stage for understanding that if we're talking about operant conditioning, the organism is learning associations between its behavior and resulting events. If the organism is learning association between events that it does not control, we're talking about classical conditioning. Now, so those were associative learning. The next topic is not going to be associative learning, not in the way we've seen it here. We're talking about biology, cognition, motivation, and conditioning. So the topics that we'll learn about here is the following: biological constraints on conditioning, cognitive processes in conditioning, learning by observation, pro-social and anti-social effects of observational learning. So first, when we talk about learning, we need to understand, again, the levels of analysis, the biopsychosocial levels of analysis, that there will be biological influences, genetic, unconditioned responses, adaptive responses, psychological influences like previous experiences, predictability of associations, and social cultural influences, culturally learned preferences, motivation affected by the presence of others will all have some influence on our learning. So learning is a very, very complicated scenario here involving a lot of factors coming into play. So looking at biology influences on conditioning. Have you ever eaten something that made you sick? And then you'll see that things that you associated with the place where you got sick or the food when you got sick will change your behavior in the future. Well, John Garcia and others found it was easier to learn associations that make sense for survival. So what this is suggesting is that food aversions can be acquired even if the unconditioned response, like when you get nauseated, get sick, does not immediately follow the stimulus, the neutral stimulus. So you eat something, as we talked about before, when you get conditioned, it's ideal for it to happen once you get the neutral stimulus, and the unconditional stimulus happens immediately. You get sick, for example. But here it's saying that you're going to delay it by hours. The reason that is simply because what Garcia is saying is that makes sense for us by way of learning through association biologically because it's necessary for survival. We need to know, and our ancestors needed to know, when they ate something really bad and it made them sick, they need to be able to associate it with that food they ate hours earlier. So that's why that's probably there, according to Garcia. When acquiring food aversions during pregnancy or illness, the body associates nausea with whatever food was eating. It's a survival mechanism in a way. That's why that does occur. They also found the following. Males in one study were more likely to see a pictured woman as attractive if the picture had a red border around it. Okay. They've also seen the following. Quail can have a sexual response linked to a fake quail more readily and strongly to a red light. So the idea, we don't know why some of this stuff happening, but we can probably see there's some sort of biological influences to these particular types of conditioning. So we have these possible conditionings because there's some benefit to us, probably from some sort of survival functioning. Also, we can see it in this way as well. In operant conditioning, can a monkey be trained to peck with its nose? No, but a pigeon can. What we mean by this is the following. A pigeon can be trained to do a variety of things, okay? But it has to be able to do something that is within its repertoire, within its type of behavior repertoire that it could do. So a pigeon, can it be trained to dive underwater? No, but a dolphin can. Can it be trained to peck with its nose? No, but a pigeon can, because a dolphin naturally does dive underwater. A pigeon does naturally peck with its nose. So operant conditioning encounters biological tendencies and limits that are difficult to override. So when you train or training an animal using operant conditioning, you have to have something to work with, something that you can shape and mold. If it's something that is totally opposite of what their natural tendencies are, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to successfully condition them to do something that is totally at odds with what type of creature they are. So what can we most easily train a dog to do is based on dogs' natural tendencies. And what does dogs do? When you first meet a dog for the very first time, it shoves its nose to you. It's sniffing your legs, you're sniffing your feet, all this type of stuff. So it has a tendency already. Detecting scents, climbing and balancing, not putting on clothes. So the idea here is that we see these natural tendencies, and it's easier to train if the biological natural behaviors are there already. So cognitive processes in conditioning. In classical conditioning, when the dog salivates at a bell, it may be due to cognition, learning to predict, even expect that food. So what they're suggesting here is that there may be a little cognitive stuff going on when we see classical conditioning. Knowing that our reactions are caused by conditioning gives us the option of mentally breaking the association, deciding that nausea associated with food aversion was actually caused by illness. In operant conditioning and fixed interval reinforcement, animals do more target behaviors, target responses around the time that the reward is more likely, as if expecting the reward. Expectation as a cognitive skill is even more evident in the ability of humans to respond to delayed reinforcers, such as a paycheck. Now, according to what we've talked about already, as soon as you've finished your work, you should be getting some sort of reward immediately. You walk into your boss's office, I want my money for the day for the work I did. But it doesn't work that way because we have delayed reinforcers. And we do that well, and we do have these reinforcers that really work for us called a paycheck. So again, there is some sort of expectation there. So cognitive conditioning is going on, cognitive process is going on in both styles of conditioning that we've already talked about. Then there's the idea of latent learning. I'm sure you've heard of latent learning before. Latent learning is basically the idea that rats appear to form cognitive maps. They can learn a maze just by wandering with no cheese to reinforce their learning. So latent learning means that you can learn something without having yet to demonstrate it, but you don't know necessarily that you've learned it. So you can, just by being around something, you can get this information up, and you don't need to understand that you know it until you need it. Okay, so the idea here, the evidence of these maps is revealed once the cheese is placed somewhere in the maze. So they've been running around this maze for a while, okay, with no reward enforcer around. Then they put some cheese in there, somewhere in the maze. And after only a few trials, these rats quickly catch up in maze solving to rats who were rewarded with cheese all along. So they demonstrated in this instance that they learned something while they were just wandering around the maze with no reinforcers in sight, compared to the rats who were being trained and reinforced with the cheese all along. They quickly caught up with that level of rat skill for that particular maze. So this is really something that really indicates that there was some learning going on, latent learning, that was not quite obvious to us. So latent learning refers to skills or knowledge gained from experience, but not apparent in behavior until rewards are given, until we have some motivating reason for the behavior to be done. Learning, rewards, and motivations. Now, I referred to this briefly a few minutes ago. Intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation refers to the desire to perform a behavior well for its own sake. The reward is internalized as a feeling of satisfaction. So you are intrinsically motivated to do something. You'll be doing this even if there was no one around to give you attaboys or attagirls. You'll be doing it anyway because you feel satisfied when you do it. It's intrinsically motivating to you. Extrinsic motivation refers to doing a behavior to receive rewards from others. So intrinsic, you do it because you want it and you like it. Extrinsic, you do it for others. Now, intrinsic motivation can sometimes be reduced by external rewards and can be prevented by using continuous reinforcement. So the notion here is this: as soon as you get some sort of reward for something that is intrinsically motivating to you, it can make you confused to an extent. Why am I doing this behavior? You feel like you're doing it for the money then, or for the outside or external reward. And then if you feel like you're doing it now for that, it may lessen your intrinsic motivation for that task. And so then when that external reward is stopped, the behavior stops. It's, for example, someone who likes playing around with computers all the time, making new computers, fixing them, and all this type of stuff. And then they make it into a job. They're now doing this for money. And that may ruin the natural, intrinsic feeling of satisfaction they got from doing that particular job. So one principle for maintaining behavior is to use as few rewards as possible and fade the rewards over time. So that's why a few slides ago, we talked about the ideas that you can reward yourself, but then sort of wean yourself off the rewards a little bit later. They do that because they don't want you to continually do a behavior and feel like you're doing the behavior because of external rewards, because you're usually, once the rewards go away, the behavior goes away. That's what reinforcement's all about. So you want to not get used to doing the behavior for a reward. It's one of the reasons why it is suggested to parents who give money for good grades to their kids to try to wean them off that, because you want them ultimately to want to get the good grades because it is intrinsically motivating to them. If they feel like they're getting the good grades only because of external rewards, then in the long run, that's all they're going to be doing for it. And it can be somewhat problematic. Learning is going to be affected by it in the long run. So what might happen if we begin to reward a behavior someone was already doing and enjoying? The behavior will not be seen as enjoyable. It can be somewhat of a problem that occurs. So we see now that when we're learning from a cognitive perspective, there's lots more things that are going on that we may have to take into account when we're talking about learning or teaching, and that includes things like intrinsic and extrinsic motivation as well. Now, the other item that I want to cover today is going to be one of the last ones, going to be learning by observation. And we've talked about this a couple of times already in a variety of places. Learning by observation. Can we, like the rats exploring the maze with no reward, learn new behaviors and skills without direct experience of conditioning? Can we do that? Yes. And one of the ways we do so is by observational learning. Watching what happens when other people do a behavior and learning from their experience. The skills required in order to do this, in order to complete observational learning, first we have mirroring. Mirroring is being able to picture ourselves doing the same action. And cognition, noticing consequences and associations. So be able to mirror ourselves as doing the action and be able to notice consequences and associations. So the observational learning processes. Modeling. Modeling is the behavior of others serves as a model. An example of how to respond to a situation. We may try this model regardless of reinforcement. So any of you who have been around kids know this happens all the time, where a kid will see some sort of behavior and will attempt to model or mimic it, even to the point where it will annoy you, make you crazy. They just keep doing it over and over and over again. So modeling, the behavior of others serves as a model, an example of how to respond to a situation, and we may try this model regardless of reinforcement, because we seem to have this need, especially when we are younger, to mimic or model behavior. And then there's vicarious conditioning, all right? Vicarious, experienced indirectly or through others. Vicarious reinforcement and punishment means our choices are affected by as we see others get consequences for their behaviors. So, for example, if you see your slightly older brother do something in view of the parents, and the parents spank your slightly older brother, you learn vicarious conditioning that if that behavior is done, you may get punishment, and you learn that. So you have just gone through sort of a learning scenario there, not to do that behavior, or you're risking getting punishment. So being able to model, to see the model, and being able to learn something from the associations and consequences of what that model is doing. That's what we're talking about here. Now, this gets us back to a study that we've referred to several times already. This is the Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment in 1961. I know it seems like a long, long time ago. Kids saw adults punching an inflated doll while narrating their aggressive behaviors, such as kick him. These kids were then put in a toy-deprived situation and acted out the same behaviors they had seen. So we can see these pictures here with the outstanding clothes of the era and fashions. All right. And so just to remind you of the Bandura study, they got a bunch of kids and they randomly assigned them to one of two groups. One experimental group, which saw the violent, aggressive interactions of the adults with the Bobo doll, and the other to the control group, where they saw the non-violent, non-aggressive interactions of the adults with the Bobo dolls. Then they put the kids in a situation where they would get frustrated, and then they wanted to see what the kid would do in the presence of the doll. And these are some examples of what the kids did. They acted out those behaviors that they, quote, learned from observing the videos of the aggressive interactions. Now, why is all this happening? Well, there's something that we refer to as mirroring in the brain. When we watch others doing or feeling something, neurons fire in patterns that would fire if we were doing the action or having the feeling ourselves. So what this is basically saying is this: when you see the aggressive video, areas of your brain, this could be areas of the young kids' brains, are lighting up in areas of the brain that would be similar to what we would be lighting up if we were doing the action ourselves. All right, that's what this is saying. When we watch others doing or feeling something, neurons fire in patterns that would fire if we were doing the action or having the feeling ourselves. That's what we're seeing mirrored in the brain. So these neurons are referred to as mirror neurons, and they fire only to reflect the actions or feelings of others. So what we see at the very bottom here, in this image, the brain of the person empathizing or mirroring the feelings of another are firing in some of the same areas of the person experiencing the pain. Notice that the areas are more closely related to the emotional anguish than the physical sensations. So up top here, at the top of the head would be where we would have the physical sensations of pain. And that's why this one's lit up on this particular image, because this is the person who's actually experiencing the pain. But empathy, when you feel, and quote, feel for the person who's experiencing the pain, this is where the more emotional stuff is lining up over here. This is the empathy. So we see this happen. So we sort of have this mirroring capacity, okay? And this mirroring can be involuntary, leading to emotional contagion of moods and attitudes spreading from one person to another. You may see this happen. Even with yawning, we sort of have a empathy for that, where we tend to yawn too. Okay, but the idea is that this mirroring the brain may help to explain why it is that, especially when we're young, we have this need to sort of mimic other people and imitate. So from mirroring to imitation, humans are prone to spontaneous imitation of both behaviors and emotion, and we refer to this as an emotional contagion. This includes even over-imitating. That is, copying adult behaviors that have no function and no reward. We just do it over and over again. And we see again, this is where kids may do this. They see a behavior and they imitate that behavior, and they do it and they do it. The act of imitating the behavior in of itself may be reinforcing and rewarding to them. Children with autism are less likely to cognitively mirror and less likely to follow someone else's gaze, as a neurotypical toddler left is doing so here. So here we see the contagion is occurring. What you're seeing here, you see the woman sitting down and the toddler are looking at each other. And then when the lady turns her gaze away, the kid automatically does the same thing. Now, again, children with autism are less likely to cognitively mirror, as we see what this kid is doing here. So this is something that we see, this mirroring thing is something that we are sort of like naturally tuned to do. All right, now let's look at some of the pro-social effects of observational learning. I'm going to go through this last few slides here um, quickly here. Pro-social behavior refers to actions which benefit others, contribute to value of groups, and follow moral codes and social norms. Parents try to teach this behavior through lectures, but it may be taught best through modeling. So when you go to the soup kitchen as a parent and you take your kids with you, you're modeling pro-social behaviors. They're more likely to give to charity, give their time to donate their time at soup kitchens and other things if they are being modeled seeing this happen in their house as they're growing up. And that's what the research shows as well. We also see the opposite as well. What happens when we learn from models who demonstrate antisocial behavior, actions that are harmful to individuals and society? So as you can see from the implication of this image here, this kid obviously knows about spanking, all right? So we see that this individual has learned this, one would say, potentially aggressive type of behavior. So children who witness violence in their homes but are not physically harmed themselves may hate violence but still may become violent more often than the average child. So it's just the being exposed to that may increase it to some extent. Perhaps this is the result of the Bobo doll effect. Under stress, we do what has been modeled for us. So what they're saying in this instance is when we get really stressed, some of the things that we have seen or that has been modeled for us in our past may be more likely to come out when you're under stress in particular. And then we have media models of violence. Do we learn antisocial behaviors such as violence from indirect observations of others in the media? We definitely see mimicking behaviors. We can see here with the wrestling. You see something and then you play it out with your peers. Okay, so research shows that viewing media violence leads to increased aggression, fight, and reduced pro-social behavior such as helping an injured person. This violence viewing effect might be explained by imitation and also by desensitization toward pain in others. Real quickly, what desensitization is: when you become desensitized, the first time you saw some sort of aggressive, if you go to movies a lot and you see slasher movies where there's lots of violence, lots of blood, lots of gore, the first time you saw that, it may have had a great deal of an impact on you that you said, oh, sort of reacted to it. But if you've seen dozens, mutual dozens of movies now with that amount of gore in it, you are not as bothered by it. You have become desensitized to it. And so that's what they're saying here. We may becoming more desensitized by such violent actions that we see it all the time and violent video games, on the news, and the movies that we watch. And so slowly, unfortunately, we are not as impacted by violence as we used to be. So in summary, looking at all the things that we've covered so far, classical conditioning, Ivan's Pavlov salivating dogs, we see new triggers for automatic responses, operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner's boxes and his pecking pigeons, the consequences influencing chosen behaviors, biological components, constraints, neurons, observational learning, Albert Bandura's Bobo dolls, mirroring pro-social and antisocial behaviors. All of these things have a great deal of impact on how and what it is that we learn. So learning about learning, from Pavlov and Watson to Skinner and Bandura, scientists have added to our understanding of how we develop our associations, our habits, and our reactions, and our patterns of behaviors. Sometimes, without question, we learn things which are not good for us. And sometimes we try to break that learning, break that code to a degree. And there are ways that we see this can be done. As we go through this remainder of this unit, in the next chapter, we'll be focusing on memory, and learning and memory are going to be very much twined together. And in a few chapters from now, we'll be seeing and revisiting some of these ideas from learning, because many of these ideas that we've just covered over the last 2 sessions have a great deal of impact in a therapeutic sense. that we can use some of these things that we've learned this week to aid people in dealing with some sort of psychological distress that they may be going through in their lives. All right, are there any questions or comments so far? All right, so then crucial to their success and learning how learning works, curiosity and a willingness to study systematically, experimenting under controlled conditions, and developing and testing ideas is what we're continually doing to try to continually better understand how learning can be executed effectively with a whole variety of different individuals. All right, that's it for today. A real quick question. I see there's quite a group of people missing today. Is there something special going on campus where people are not showing up, or you know what's going on? There's only like a handful of you guys here today. Any ideas? Just questions. Okay. All right. All right. Well, that's it for today. If there's no other questions, you guys are free to go. We'll start up next week with the chapter on memory. All right. Take care. Be safe.